Minister, on Friday, Fridays for Future, the young people in that organisation, in the student organisations and in Extinction Rebellion will gather outside this House as part of global action on COP27, and they won't be praising the Taoiseach or indeed you for action, but rather for inaction. And they will be carrying clocks with them and to symbolise the fact that we're running out of time. But they're also very aware that this has taken place in a venue that is mired with human rights abuses. And I want to ask you, are you aware of those grave human rights abuses of climate and environmental activists in Egypt, and will you make any statement on the matter, either when you're there or about it, or what intentions have the Irish Government got in relation to this, or will they just turn a blind eye?
Minister, thanks.
I will be attending COP27 as head of the Irish delegation for the second week of the conference from the 14th to the 18th of November. Ireland continues to advocate for COPs to be transparent and inclusive for all, promoting active participation of women and young people in negotiations and facilitating civil society attendance and engagement. This remains the case more than ever for COP27. Human rights issues form part of Ireland's regular engagement with Egypt. Ireland has expressed concern regarding the protection of human rights in Egypt, including rights of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, and the constrained space for civil society. The protection of human rights defenders, which includes the fight against reprisals, is a key part of our multilateral work at the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. Ireland's long-standing support for climate justice and adaptation recognises that women, girls, LGBTQ+ people and other marginalised groups are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis and more vulnerable to the shocks and stresses associated with current and future climate change. Reflecting this and our domestic commitment to climate literacy, public engagement and participation, Ireland will also be engaged in the development of a new action plan for the Action of Climate Empowerment ACE stream, placing these issues alongside human rights and youth participation at the forefront of the process where they belong. I will also be setting aside time in my programme to meet with civil society groups, including human rights activists, as I did in Glasgow last year.
I just want to mention probably the highest profile political prisoner in Egypt, Alaa El Fattah, and Alaa has been in hunger strike since April. He's 10 years now languishing in jail because he was an activist and an environmentalist. And since he took over the regime in Egypt, El-Sisi has built a dozen prisons in 10 years. There are 60,000 activists locked up, and this week many of them were arrested and will probably be tortured and thrown in prison for a long period of time because they're environmentalists and climate activists. His sister, and I just think it's worth quoting her, has said that those who attend the COP event do not realise that their best allies are those who are languishing in prison, the ones who, in Egypt, who really give a damn about the planet. Now, all COPs are problematic, and this venue is particularly problematic. But aside from the problems that go with the venue, I would like to argue that we're not just engaged in a greenwashing of companies in relation to COP here, and many big companies play a big role, but we're greenwashing an entire state, a state that is known for its repressive measures. And I'd like you to comment further.
One of the proudest moments I've had as a member of this House was when I took part in a joint Oireachtas visit to Egypt some 6 years ago, if I recall rightly, to visit Ibrahim Halawa when he was in prison, imprisoned outside Cairo. And it was a remarkable, I don't think anyone here was on the delegation, but it was one of the most important, interesting and engaging events I've taken part in here. So I'm very familiar with what you talk about in terms of the freedom within Egypt for such prisoners, the need to think of those at this time. Can I say one measure that we have progressed as government recently is funding directly of a UN Rapporteur Special Office for environmentalists who are facing persecution or state oppression in whatever variety of different forms. We were, I think if I'm going to memory here now again, ourselves in Austria came together to specifically finance and support frontline defenders to be able to act on behalf of environmentalists who are imprisoned or who are under threat from whatever different types of regime. That office has just been established following funding. An international office from the Irish Government. I had the pleasure of meeting its chief executive here in government buildings only a few weeks ago. And I think that is the best approach to what we're doing in the UN Security Council, what we do in the UN General Assembly, and through the international legal mechanisms that are open to us, to absolutely stand up for the rights for those who may be persecuted for what they believe in, or for their identity or gender or any other, which we see as in contravention of the UN Charter of Human Rights.
Deputy.
The problem is, however, that funding human rights groups and funding for countries who suffer the most, although important, it's not going to deal with the problem of the rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. The atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide has increased from 358 parts per million in 1994 to 415 parts per million today. And you understand, and I understand, that that's hugely problematic, and that science is telling us that we must leave 80% of known fossil fuels in the ground. Now, Micheál Martin has tweeted tonight that he is so proud, and we have to take responsibility as leaders to drive the transformation necessary. But he will come back from Egypt and step off the plane and start to argue, as has been done in this House by many of the leaders, that we need to increase our fossil fuel infrastructure in the current period. That is absolutely not going to do anything to help. That will hinder and will utterly fail the groups of young people who will stand outside the Dáil on Friday. But it is not their responsibility that this is happening. It's the responsibility of the leaders who stand up and COP and say we can hold our heads high, and they can't hold their heads high, because CO2 emissions are increasing year on year ever since the first COP, ever since Kyoto.
Minister to respond.
Right, that fear is real and belongs to everyone, of every party, of every age, of every country, and it is the primary challenge that we face in this time, and has to guide us towards radical system change to reduce the emissions. I would say that test on that is going to come in the very near future, when our latest iteration of the Climate Action Plan will put forward proposals in areas like transport and energy and agriculture or industry, which are beyond compare in the scale of change that need to be made. A lot of them will not be popular. A lot of them will have real, as we just seen earlier on, in discussion on some of the projects that we have to do, but it'll be similar. My own constituency, I would imagine, and other Dublin coastal constituencies along the East Coast, the development of offshore wind. I know I've heard some of your own colleagues, Deputy Boyd Barrett and others, raising concerns, which are absolutely valid. We have to listen to every aspect of this, but we have to be careful that we don't find ourselves not able to act. It's the same in transport. I've been going around the country to every local authority as best I can, and absolutely fascinating to listen to a lot of the intelligence that's there in our local government, but also a sense that it's going to be difficult for us to do the scale of change we need to do to reduce our transport emissions. And I could go through any sector with that. The test of this is going to be in all of us in the next 5 years, next 3 years I would argue, as to can we do the scale of system change that's needed. And that's going to be a test for everyone of every party.